Subscribe to my YouTube channel for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. David Martinez had always prided himself on being a man of principles. At 42, he understood the delicate balance required when marrying into a family, especially one with a 19-year-old daughter who had every reason to resent his presence. But what he hadn't anticipated was how Emma's quiet rebellion would evolve into something far more complex than teenage defiance. The first sign that his carefully constructed boundaries were about to be tested came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in October. David was alone in his home office, reviewing architectural plans for a new project, when he heard the familiar creak of footsteps on the hardwood stairs. His wife, Sarah, had left for her book club an hour earlier, and he'd assumed Emma was out with friends as usual. David? Emma's voice carried a tremor he'd never heard before. Can we talk? He looked up from his blueprints to find her standing in the doorway, her auburn hair damp from the rain, wearing a simple sweater that somehow made her look older than her 19 years. There was something different about her posture, less of the casual confidence he'd grown accustomed to, more of a vulnerability that made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar concern. Of course, he said, setting down his pencil. Everything okay? Emma stepped into the room, closing the door behind her, a gesture that should have been innocent, but somehow felt weighted with significance. She settled into the leather chair, across from his desk, the same chair where they'd had countless conversations about college applications, career choices, and the mundane details of daily life. But tonight, the space between them felt charged with an energy he couldn't quite identify. I broke up with Tyler, she said quietly, her green eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. David felt a mixture of relief and concern. Tyler had been Emma's boyfriend for nearly 2 years, and while David had always been polite to the young man, he'd never particularly warmed to him. There was something about Tyler's casual disregard for Emma's feelings that had always bothered David, though. He'd never voiced his concerns to Sarah or Emma directly. I'm sorry to hear that, he said carefully. Do you want to talk about what happened? Emma's laugh was bitter, lacking any trace of humor. He said I was too complicated, that I expected too much from people. She finally looked up at him and David was struck by the pain in her eyes. He said I was looking for something that doesn't exist in real relationships. David felt his jaw tighten. The urge to comfort her was overwhelming, but he forced himself to maintain the appropriate distance. Tyler doesn't speak for everyone. Emma, you deserve someone who appreciates your complexity, not someone who sees it as a burden. Do I? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just too much for people to handle. Too intense, too demanding. The vulnerability in her voice made David's heart ache. In the 3 years since he'd married Sarah, he'd watched Emma grow from a rebellious teenager into a thoughtful young woman. He'd seen her struggle with the typical challenges of adolescence, but he'd also witnessed her remarkable capacity for empathy, her fierce loyalty to the people she loved, and her unwavering commitment to her principles. Emma, he said gently, you're not too much. You're exactly enough. Any man who can't see that isn't worthy of your time. She studied his face for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. You really believe that? I do, he said, without hesitation. The silence that followed was comfortable at first, but as it stretched on, David became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. Emma's gaze had become more intense, more searching, as if she were trying to read something in his face that he wasn't even aware he was revealing. David, she said finally, can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met under different circumstances? The question hit him like a physical blow. He felt his breath catch, his carefully maintained composure wavering for just a moment. Emma, I know it's a strange question, she continued, as if she hadn't noticed his reaction. But sometimes I think about it, about how different things might have been if you weren't my stepfather. If you were just David, and I was just Emma. David's mouth went dry. This was dangerous territory he'd never allowed himself to explore, not even in the privacy of his own thoughts. Emma, we can't think like that. What we have is what? She interrupted, leaning forward slightly. A family relationship. Because sometimes it doesn't feel like that to me. Sometimes it feels like something else entirely. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. David felt as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff, with Emma holding out her hand and asking him to jump. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings, reminded him of his responsibilities, his marriage, the trust that Sarah had placed in him, that there was another part of him, a part he'd been trying to ignore for months, that wanted nothing more than to take Emma's hand and leap into the unknown. Emma, he said, his voice hoarse, you're Sarah's daughter. You're 19 years old. This conversation, age is just a number, she said softly. And as for being Mom's daughter, well, that's just an accident of genetics, isn't it? It's not like we're actually related. David stood abruptly, needing to put distance between them. He walked to the window, staring out at the rain-streaked glass without really seeing it. It's not that simple, and you know it, isn't it? Emma's voice was closer now, and when he turned, he found that she had followed him across the room. She was standing just a few feet away, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something light and floral that she'd started wearing in the past year. David, I've been thinking about this for a long time. About you. About us. There is no us, he said firmly, though the words felt like lies on his tongue. Then why do you look at me the way you do? The question stopped him cold. I don't. You do, she insisted. When you think I'm not paying attention, when we're having dinner and Mum's talking about her day, when we're watching a movie and I laugh at something funny, you look at me like I'm not your stepdaughter at all. David's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. Emma, even if that were true, and I'm not saying it as it wouldn't matter, I love your mother. I married her. I made a commitment. But are you happy? Emma asked, and the question was like a knife to his chest. Really, truly happy? David wanted to lie, to give her the answer that would end this conversation and restore the safe boundaries they'd somehow crossed. But as he looked into her eyes, he found himself unable to speak the words. The truth was, he wasn't unhappy with Sarah. She was a good woman, a devoted mother, a caring partner. They had a comfortable life together, built on mutual respect and shared values. But if he were honest with himself, truly honest, he would have to admit that what he felt for Sarah was different from what he'd felt for the woman he'd married. 10 years earlier, before cancer had taken her from him, with Sarah, he'd found companionship, stability, a sense of purpose. But passion? The kind of soul-deep connection that made him feel truly alive. That had been missing from his life for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like, until Emma had started looking at him with those knowing eyes. It's not about happiness, he said finally. It's about doing what's right. And what if doing what's right means ignoring what we both feel? David closed his eyes, trying to block out the sight of her face, the hope and longing he saw there. Emma, please. Don't do this. Don't do what? Don't tell you the truth. Don't admit that I've been thinking about you in ways that have nothing to do with family. Don't say that when I close my eyes at night, it's your face I see. The confession hit him like a physical blow. Every carefully constructed wall he'd built around his feelings came crashing down, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He wanted to tell her that he'd been fighting the same battle, that there had been moments when he'd had to leave the room, because being near her was too overwhelming, too tempting. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. "Emma," he said, his voice barely controlled, "you're confusing gratitude with something else. I've been a stable presence in your life at a time when you needed one. It's natural that you might feel—" "Don't," she said sharply, and for the first time, there was anger in her voice. "Don't patronize me. Don't tell me what I'm feeling. I'm not a child anymore, David. I know the difference between gratitude and this." She gestured between them, and David felt the air in the room grow thick with tension. He knew he should walk away, should end this conversation before it went any further. But something in her eyes held him frozen in place. "What exactly is this, Emma?" he asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. "You know what it is," she said softly. "You've known for months, maybe longer. That's why you started avoiding me. Why you stopped coming to my soccer games. Why you suddenly became too busy to help me with my college applications." David felt his chest tighten. She was right, of course. He had been avoiding her, had been desperately trying to maintain distance as he'd become increasingly aware of the way she affected him. But he'd hoped his efforts had been subtle enough that she wouldn't notice. "I was trying to be appropriate," he said. "Appropriate," she repeated, as if the word left a bitter taste in her mouth. "Is that what you call it when you look at me like you want to kiss me?" The words hung between them like a challenge, and David felt his resolve wavering. Because she was right. God help him, she was absolutely right. There had been moments, brief, stolen moments, when he'd looked at her and felt a desire so intense it had taken his breath away. "Emma," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Even if there was something between us, it could never work. The complications, the hurt it would cause to who?" She interrupted. "To Mom? She doesn't have to know. No one has to know." "I would know," David said firmly. "I would know that I betrayed her trust, that I violated every principle I've ever held dear." Emma's face crumpled slightly, and David felt a stab of guilt at the pain in her eyes. "So that's it? You're just going to pretend that none of this exists? That we don't feel what we feel? What choice do I have?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Emma, I won't destroy my marriage. I won't hurt your mother like that. Even if it means we're both miserable." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. David wanted to tell her that she wouldn't be miserable, that she was young and beautiful and had her whole life ahead of her, that someday she would meet someone who could love her openly, without shame or secrecy. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was, he couldn't imagine being happy knowing that he'd walked away from something that felt so real, so powerful, so utterly consuming. "Emma," he said finally, "I need you to understand something. What I feel for you." He stopped, realizing he was about to admit something he'd sworn never to acknowledge. "What I might feel for you doesn't change the fact that I'm married to your mother, that I made a commitment to her, that I won't break that commitment, no matter what it costs me." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "And what about what it costs me?" The question broke something inside him. Without thinking, he reached out and touched her cheek, brushing away a tear with his thumb. The contact sent electricity through his entire body, and he saw her eyes widen in response. "Emma," he whispered, her name like a prayer on his lips. For a moment the world stopped. They stood there, frozen in time, his hand on her face, her eyes locked on his. David felt as though he were drowning in her gaze, losing himself in the depths of her longing. And then, as if pulled by an invisible force, they began to move toward each other. David's rational mind screamed warnings, but his body seemed to have a will of its own. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, could smell the intoxicating scent of her perfume. Her lips were parted slightly, her breathing shallow and rapid. Just as their faces were inches apart, the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway shattered the moment. David jerked back as if he'd been burned, his heart pounding with a mixture of desire and guilt. "That's your mother," he said, his voice barely recognizable. Emma nodded, her eyes still fixed on his face. "David, we can't," he said, cutting her off. "We can't do this, Emma. Not now, not ever." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were both thinking the same thing. They had crossed a line tonight, and there was no going back. Emma wiped her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself. "I should go to my room." "Emma," David called as she reached the door. She turned back to him, hope flickering in her eyes. "We LL. Figure this out. Somehow." She nodded, though they both knew that figuring it out would be easier said than done. As she slipped out of the room, David sank back into his chair, his hands shaking as he tried to process what had just happened. He could hear Sarah's voice in the hallway, calling out cheerful greetings as she returned from her book club. In a few minutes, she would come looking for him, would kiss him hello, and tell him about her evening. She would trust him completely, just as she always had. And he would have to look her in the eye and pretend that everything was normal, that he hadn't just come within inches of betraying her with her own daughter. As he heard Sarah's footsteps on the stairs, David closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for the performance of his life. But deep down, he knew that something fundamental had changed tonight. The careful balance he'd maintained for 3 years had been shattered, and he had no idea how to put it back together. The only thing he knew for certain was that Emma had been right about one thing. There was no going back to the way things were before. In the days that followed, David threw himself into his work with desperate intensity. He arrived at the office early, stayed late, and took on projects that required travel anything to avoid being alone in the house with Emma. But his efforts to maintain distance only seemed to make things worse. Emma, for her part, seemed to understand the game they were now playing. She didn't push for another private conversation, didn't try to corner him when Sarah wasn't around. Instead, she became a master of subtle communication. A lingering look across the dinner table, fingers that brushed his when she handed him a glass of water, a smile that held secrets only they shared. Sarah, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling between her husband and daughter, continued with her routine. She mentioned in passing that Emma seemed happier lately, more engaged with family life. The observation made David's stomach churn with guilt. 2 weeks after their conversation in his office, David found himself alone in the house on a Saturday morning. Sarah had gone to her yoga class, and Emma was supposed to be at her part-time job at the local bookstore. He was in the kitchen, making coffee and trying to focus on the newspaper, when he heard footsteps on the stairs. "I thought you were working today," he said without looking up, recognizing the light tread of Emma's feet. "I switched shifts with someone," she said, her voice casual but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite identify. "I wanted to talk to you." David's hand stilled on the coffee mug. "Emma, we've been through this. Have we?" she asked, coming to stand beside him at the counter. She was wearing jeans and a soft blue sweater that brought out the color of her eyes. "Because it seems to me like we haven't talked about anything. You've been avoiding me. I've been busy with work." "You've been hiding," she corrected gently. "And I understand why. But David, we can't keep pretending that nothing happened." David finally looked at her and immediately regretted the decision. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. Not just physically, though she was certainly that, but in a deeper way that spoke to something essential in his soul. There was an intelligence in her eyes, a warmth that drew him in, despite all his efforts to maintain distance. "What do you want me to say, Emma?" he asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "That I think about you. That I lie awake at night, wondering what it would be like to." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter what I want. It matters what's right. And what if what's right is being honest about our feelings?" Our feelings. David laughed bitterly. "Emma, I'm 42 years old. I'm married to your mother. There is no our feelings in this situation. There's only my responsibility to my family and my commitment to doing what's right." Emma studied his face for a long moment. "You know what I think?" she said finally. "I think you're scared." "Of course I'm scared," David admitted. "I'm terrified. Do you have any idea what this could do to your mother? To our family? To you?" "I'm scared too," Emma said softly. "But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering, what if?" David set down his coffee mug with more force than necessary. "Emma, you're 19 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. You'll meet someone like Tyler," she interrupted. "Someone who thinks I'm too complicated, too intense, too much. Someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved," David said firmly. "Someone who doesn't come with all the complications that I do." "But what if I don't want someone else?" Emma asked, stepping closer to him. "What if I want someone who already sees me, who already understands me? What if I want someone who makes me feel like I'm not too much, but exactly enough?" David felt his resolve crumbling. Every word she spoke echoed thoughts he'd been trying to suppress for months. "Emma, please. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not trying to make it hard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to make it real." Before David could respond, Emma reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. The contact was electric, sending shockwaves through his entire body. He could feel his heart racing beneath her palm, could see the recognition in her eyes as she felt it too. "Emma," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know you feel it too," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "I know you do. When you look at me, when we're in the same room, when we accidentally touch, I can see it in your eyes." David wanted to deny it, to push her away, to do the responsible thing. But as he looked down at her, at the hope and longing in her eyes, at the way she was looking at him like he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered, he found himself unable to speak the words that would end this. "What are you asking me to do, Emma?" he asked instead, his voice barely audible. "I'm asking you to be honest," she said. "With me. With yourself. I'm asking you to stop pretending that what we feel doesn't exist." David closed his eyes, trying to block out the sight of her face, the feel of her hand on his chest. "And then what? Say I admit that I care about you, that I think about you in ways I shouldn't. What then?" "Then we figure it out," Emma said simply. "Together." "It's not that simple," David said, opening his eyes to look at her. "Emma, I love your mother. Maybe not the way I should. Maybe not the way she deserves. But I do love her. And I won't hurt her." "Then we'll be careful," Emma said. "We'll be discreet. No," David said firmly, stepping back from her. "No, we won't. Because that's not who I am. I won't sneak around behind your mother's back. I won't live a lie." Emma's face fell, but she didn't give up. Then what? We just pretend this never happened. We go back to the way things were. I don't know, David admitted. I honestly don't know. But I know that what you're suggesting isn't the answer. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of their situation settling between them. David could see the tears gathering in Emma's eyes, could feel his own heart breaking as he watched her struggle with his rejection. Emma, he said gently, I need you to understand something. What I feel for you, it's real. It's powerful. It's unlike anything I've felt in years. But that doesn't mean we can act on it. Sometimes love means making the hard choice, even when it hurts. Love? Emma repeated, her voice barely a whisper. You love me? David realized what he'd said, and the admission hung between them like a confession. Emma, you love me, she said again, and this time there was wonder in her voice. You actually love me? David felt his defenses crumbling. Yes, he said finally. God help me, yes, I love you. I love your mind, your heart, your spirit. I love the way you see the world, the way you challenge me to be better. I love you in a way that terrifies me, because it's so much more than I should feel. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I love you too, she said. I love you so much it hurts. I love you so much that I can't imagine a future without you in it. The words hit David like a physical blow. He wanted nothing more than to take her in his arms, to hold her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But he knew that crossing that line would be the beginning of the end for his marriage, for his integrity, for the family he'd worked so hard to build. Emma, he said, his voice breaking, loving you is the most beautiful and the most painful thing I've ever experienced. But it can't be enough. It has to be enough to love you from a distance, to want what's best for you even if it's not me. But what if you are what's best for me? Emma asked, stepping closer to him again. What if we're what's best for each other? David felt tears stinging his eyes. Then we'll have to live with that tragedy. Because sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes doing what's right means sacrificing what we want most. Emma reached up and touched his cheek, and David closed his eyes at the contact. I don't want to sacrifice this, she whispered. I don't want to sacrifice you. Neither do I, David admitted. But I have to. We have to. They stood there for a moment, holding each other's gaze, both of them fighting back tears. Finally, Emma nodded slowly. I understand, she said. I don't like it, but I understand. Emma, David said, I need you to know that this isn't about you not being enough. You're more than enough. You're everything. But I made a commitment to your mother, and I have to honor that. No matter what it costs me. I know, Emma said, though her voice was thick with unshed tears. I know you do, and I love you for it, even though it's breaking my heart. David felt his own heart shattering as he watched her struggle with his decision. What can I do? He asked. How can I make this easier for you? Emma wiped her eyes and took a step back. You can't, she said simply. But you can promise me something. What? Promise me that if things change, if circumstances were different, you wouldn't hesitate. Promise me that in another world, another life, you would choose me. David felt his breath catch. Emma, promise me, she said. Again, her voice firm despite her tears. David looked at her for a long moment, memorizing every detail of her face. In another world, another life, he said finally, I would choose you every time, without hesitation, without question. You would be my everything. Emma smiled through her tears. That's enough, she said. It has to be enough. As they heard, Sarah's car pulling into the driveway. David and Emma stepped apart, both of them struggling to compose themselves. The sound of the garage door opening marked the end of their moment of honesty. The return to the careful pretense they would now have to maintain. "Emma," David said as she turned to leave. "I know," she said without looking back. "I know." And with that, she was gone, leaving David alone in the kitchen with his shattered heart and his intact principles. He had chosen duty over desire, responsibility over passion. He had done the right thing, so why did it feel like the wrong choice? As Sarah's cheerful voice filled the house, David closed his eyes and prepared once again to play the role of the devoted husband. But deep down, he knew that something fundamental had changed. He had acknowledged his love for Emma, had seen the depth of her feelings for him, and there was no going back to the innocence of before. The question now was whether either of them would be strong enough to live with the choice they'd made, and whether love, even unexpressed, would be enough to sustain them through the long, difficult road ahead. Only time would tell if David's understanding of boundaries had been wisdom, or the greatest mistake of his life.